This is the Secure CyberConnect podcast with Jay Adamson and Juana Atkinson, where we're joined by information and cybersecurity technology and talent acquisition professionals who share their journeys, unique perspectives, and offer advice and guidance. Our topics on this episode will be cybersecurity, web3, and blockchain, decentralized innovation. Today, we're absolutely thrilled to be joined by Juana Attieh. Juana is the Chief Strategy Officer at AMLOK, a startup focused on building a blockchain-powered solution for community-driven crowdfunding. The focus lies in leveraging blockchain technology to empower local economies and help build sustainable community infrastructure. Juana has an impressive track record within Web3, blockchain governance, and strategic innovation, and is a recognized leader in the Web3 space, having been involved in numerous projects at the intersection of decentralization and the social impact. Juana is also a passionate advocate about integrating superintelligence and human-centered governance systems. Juana, welcome to the Secure CyberConnect podcast, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm really excited about this conversation.
So, Juana, we obviously want to kick things off by you giving us a very brief, high-level overview on some of the key themes we'll be exploring in our discussion on this episode.
Yeah, of course. Some of the things we'll be talking about blockchain, Web3, decentralized governance, community, health and wellness, and how all of these things converge to disrupt traditional models and corporations that we know of today.
And our starting question for all of our guests is, would you be kind enough to maybe share something that you're particularly proud of or excited about that isn't typically featured on your LinkedIn profile, for example?
Yeah, I often joke about how I have multiple personalities and they kind of live on different social medias. So obviously on my LinkedIn, there's my professional career and my accomplishments there. But then if you go to my private Instagram, I'm diving with sharks, I'm hiking mountains. I did a 2-week trek on the Pacific Crest Trail. I have a really big Cane Corso. I take macroscopic photography. So there's this split in the way I live. But what I'm really proud of is how they kind of converge into this balanced whole. In an industry like ours, it's really fast paced and it's very mentally consuming and you're constantly, it's evolving and it's really easy to get lost in the work. So just building this rhythm that's allowed me to disconnect, recharge and stay present is really great. And then the second thing that I am pretty proud of is, I'm building Amllock with not just my co-founder, but he's also my life partner. And I think obviously that's very interesting and it comes with a lot of these challenges, but we've managed to create something that works and navigate it together. And I think it's been a really interesting journey and we're really proud of that.
Appreciate you sharing it, Joanne. And I think obviously having that adventure background and lifestyle allows you to have diversity of thought because you're exposed to different cultures and mindsets. I'm sure that sort of aided you on your journey.
Yeah, and rightly so. Absolutely. Sounds fantastic.
Now, look, in any career, of course, mistakes are made along the way, but it's about how we learn from those mistakes that shape our real growth. Now, for our listeners, hearing about real world challenges and from experts such as yourself and how they overcome them is going to be invaluable lessons. So could you please share with us a mistake that you've made in your career and what important lesson you learned along the way?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously, there's many mistakes, especially in this space that's really new. But one thing that really stuck with me was in my very first startup that I ever worked on. I was very excited to be a co-founder, and we were building very exciting things and very, revolutionary work, really. But you jump straight into it. You want to start building. You want to raise funds. You want to get out there. That you kind of bypass the important things like setting up the governance structures, the decision-making processes, the roles and the responsibilities. And, while that is fine at the beginning and it works, but then later it causes a lot of frustration. I think that's really where we see a lot of co-founder conflict. So it causes a lot of misalignment, confusion. So I think the biggest lesson is no matter how excited you are to build, to get into something, it's just important to take a step back and just do all of these things. Obviously, co-founders, we wear multiple hats. You are involved in everything, but there is something that's really what you're supposed to be doing. And it helps people kind of stay in their lanes and work sustainably and seamlessly. So that was one of my biggest lessons. And I think I'm really happy that it happened early on, because now I find that, I've been able to really work in a more sustainable manner with all the different projects that I engage with.
That's brilliant. Appreciate you sharing.
Yeah, a valuable lesson for a lot of startups, I think, that, to be fair. So, Juana, look, Web3 and blockchain technologies are obviously rapidly evolving. They're creating incredibly exciting opportunities and significant challenges across all industries, especially within areas such as cyber and decentralized governance. For our audience, many of whom are leaders within technology and cybersecurity, could you briefly explain what these technologies entail? How are they disrupting traditional models, and why have they become so critical to the future of both business and security?
Yeah, of course. I think web3 and blockchain, what they really represent is this shift from centralized control to more distributed systems. So, instead of us relying on banks and corporations or these middlemen, now we have blockchain that secures transactions through cryptographic proof. So, data becomes immutable, transparent, verifiable. And so, web3 takes it even further by leveraging, smart contracts, NFTs, DeFi, decentralized identity governance. And what it really does is it gives people more control over their data and their assets. And this really disrupts traditional models. It eliminates single points of failure. It improves cybersecurity, governance, access to finance, and especially for businesses, it automates processes, removes intermediaries. It makes processes and operations faster, cheaper, more transparent. And what I find really interesting is really it's enabled this like new way and strategy for engagement and tokenized economies. So there's like all these new economic possibilities that weren't available before. And, now businesses can also operate and open in new markets because of this access. And that I think is really disruptive and really interesting.
Absolutely. And how does decentralization drive innovation in areas like crowdfunding and governance, for example?
Yeah, obviously, other than the things that we've touched on, like automation and security and trust, I think the biggest thing here is like how it democratizes access. So, now you have people that were previously excluded from being able to invest or being a part of decision making. They can actively participate through these new means. So, for example, for governance, it removes this hierarchical decision making and it replaces it with, transparent participatory models and mechanisms. And now you have people from all over being able to engage with communities and projects and have a say with how they evolve. And then obviously for crowdfunding, decentralization, it removes gatekeepers. It allows for anyone to participate in funding. It allows for different projects from all around and businesses to access capital. And so centralized crowdfunding platforms, they have restrictions, they have high fees, but through blockchain technology, crowdfunding now enables, access to capital, involvement, investment, collaboration in ways that weren't really possible before.
In terms of building trust in decentralized systems and with the rise of decentralized finance or DeFi for abbreviation purposes, for example, I suppose trust obviously remains a key challenge in decentralized networks in terms of both their adoption and in building long-term success. Since this removes more traditional intermediaries such as banks and governments and large corporations, I guess the big question is, how can organizations and cybersecurity leaders build trust in Web3 based systems? What steps can organizations and cybersecurity leaders take to mitigate these risks, related to trust and security? How do they address security risks in general and ensure strong risk management within these ecosystems?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, trust here is quite layered. There's different aspects to it. Obviously, from a technology perspective, because of the open nature of these systems, there's a lot more threats that we're going to be prone to. Obviously, I think there's things like smart contract vulnerabilities, oracle manipulations, scams, rug pulls, wallet drains. So there's all these different ways that bad actors could really affect these projects. So I think obviously being very proactive with your risk management, constantly auditing smart contracts, being very, diligent about the people that you work with, because of its open nature. You have a lot of different people now being involved in it in a different way. So having these mechanisms in place really early on while you're being involved in DeFi is really important. But I think to me, also, I believe that trust is really derived from true inclusion and decentralization when it comes to the governance of these systems. So how are the decisions being made? Who's involved in these decisions? How are they involved? Are they voting? What are the voting systems? Do they have the right true incentives to get involved? What are the barriers? an accessibility to people, and is it truly inclusive, and is it governed properly? So I think that this is where organizations could really pay attention to how these governance mechanisms, when it comes to advancing their systems and being involved in DeFi, and who are these people that are making decisions, and how are they making those decisions. I think being very diligent about that is very important.
And how important is user education and awareness in terms of sort of campaigns and initiatives?
Yeah, I think education, especially because we're still early on in a way that we haven't seen this like seamless convergence. Education is key, especially if you're building in an open community or participating in DeFi, you need to be constantly educating your community, your users. So always remembering the ethos of not your keys, not your crypto, not your assets, not your data, whatever it may be, self-custody, and always, being very proactive with your community, with your users, and being very transparent and open about how things are being developed, I think is obviously, yes, very, very important.
And we see the blockchain market, for instance, as a more sort of a broader area, significantly growing in the last 12 months. I think I read a report most recently saying it grew from 28 billion to 49 billion at present day. Obviously, the web3 and DeFi space is a small portion of that, equating to around about sort of 5 billion. It's set to grow about 38% this year. Now, what role do you see blockchain playing in the future of tech and, of course, cybersecurity, particularly in relation to data privacy and secure transactions?
Yeah, we're living in a more interconnected world than we've ever experienced before. We're so connected to our devices, and this creates a massive opportunities for more bad actors, for privacy issues, for threats. Especially, it's dangerous, I believe, for centralized digital architecture that we have today. But thanks to blockchain and obviously its distributed nature, and then alongside the consensus mechanisms, the security, the immutability, we have a new way of being connected in a safer way. And there's this concept, of like pushing the power to the edges, pushing like involvement and access to the edges, having more participation in a distributed way through the concept of things like obviously decentralized physical infrastructure, all thanks to blockchain. Now we have an opportunity for more people to be involved, but also for data to be stored in a way that's safer and more secure, and it removes the single point of failure when it comes to security. I think that's the biggest advancement.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of organizations in most recent years adapt decentralized hosting for the web domains, for instance. That mitigates against DDoS attacks, and we all know that's one of the major areas of concern for organizations, to ensure that their sites and their services are up. So decentralized hosting obviously can combat that. And just to sort of go over what you spoke about a moment ago, the 5 key reasons that we're actually seeing organizations adopt Web3 and blockchain technologies is building trust. That's the key one that myself and Jay are seeing and hearing in conversations. But much similar to security as a broader remit, there's a triad: is that data trust, data integrity, and of course availability. And the beauty of Web3 itself, it provides that transparency and traceability, as you mentioned earlier. But the key kicker is the reduction in cost, and of course the risk is where we see the real value being driven. Now, curious to gain your perspective in terms of how do you see blockchain evolving in terms of securing sensitive data in industries such as healthcare and finance?
Yeah, absolutely. I think over the past few years as well, we've seen a lot of advancements in cryptography. There's zero knowledge proofs, there's things like homomorphic encryption, and those are enabling industries that handle highly sensitive data, like healthcare and finance, to still benefit from blockchain security and decentralization, but still be able to preserve user privacy. So these technologies, they allow for data to be verified and processed without exposing its contents, for example. And this allows, ensures compliance, strict privacy regulations, but still allows them to leverage the transparency and, like you said, the cost effectiveness and the automation of these distributed networks. And I think that the biggest thing here is the ability to securely store and verify things like medical records, financial history, identity documents, all of these on the blockchain. It's really revolutionary, especially for centralized governments, for example, that were outdated or have failed. It unlocks opportunities for these new economies in ways that were previously inaccessible. And then as well, I think beyond this, there's the rise of decentralized identity. So this means users can own and control their data. They can decide when and with whom to share it. And so these make privacy preserving blockchain applications, one of the most important developments, I think, for the future of user-centric digital ecosystems.
That's really impressive. And we've seen a few solutions that are on the market, enhancing that security and trust within the Web3 space. Things such as Web3 antivirus, for instance, as well as address validation. And we've also seen solutions that provide transaction simulation to ensure that those domains that are being sent to are your real active domains, not ones that are perhaps linked to bad actors. And having that ability to sort of audit and test in real time is really impressive. Now, in terms of regulation, the challenges there, where do you feel Web3 blockchains moving, in particular with governments at sort of a global scale and regulations addressing emerging challenges when it comes to security and compliance?
Yeah, I think, over the past few years of my involvement in this space, we have seen a rapid interest in governments and regulators in this space. I think it is still quite varied around the world. We have governments that are more readily adopting these technologies. They're already outputting regulations. They're, trying to being more first users, maybe you can think of the UAE or Singapore. But then we also have some slower governments that are maybe taking more time. I would say more in North America and in Canada, but there's still significant interest and there's a positive direction, I believe, in adopting Web3 and blockchain. And in all honesty, the way I kind of think about it as well, I think it makes sense in the way how these governments are formed. We have top-down governments or bottom-up. So change takes time in different jurisdictions and countries. But in general, I think, there is definitely an interest, but I believe, there is rise, there's sandbox environments, there's more presence in conferences, there's regulators working really closely with innovators and builders in this space. And I think really that's the only way it should happen. I believe implementing stringent regulations early on, especially with people that maybe are not as involved in this space, it could really hinder the potential of what these technologies could bring. However, on the flip side, we really do need involvement in the sense of, mitigating risk, creating guardrails, being more cautious about all these different risks and possibilities. But I think it needs to be this balance of, how do these open communities govern themselves? And can these regulators adopt these mechanisms as well when they try to, govern and regulate a space like this? Because we don't want the ethos of the openness and collaboration in the space to go away when these regulators, step in and try to govern how the space could evolve.
Yeah, and I think it's a great opportunity for emerging regions, perhaps some regions in the APAC. I know they're sort of making strides, and it's a great way for them to leapfrog a digital transformation process. It can certainly put them ahead by sort of 10 or 15 years in terms of where they are at the moment. So we do commend you and the team on your efforts and your contributions to the space in that respect. Now, moving away from that, the entrepreneurship, you're a founder, you've been on a really interesting journey, but what does Web3 entrepreneurship mean to you, and how do you see that transforming traditional business models?
Honestly, I think Web3 entrepreneurship is truly a paradigm shift. I really believe it disrupts almost everything that we know in a sense, or at least builds up on it. Not only from a technological perspective, but to me, more importantly, what I found is from a societal standpoint. It redefines ownership, coordination, value exchange. And I say this all the time. I really believe Web3 is about community and not competition. I really believe we'll start to see more of a shift with how, the value of currency will be represented. We are primal beings. We're tribal by nature, and so we need community. We need to be building together. And I think Web3 brings this concept back, and we'll have this mental shift of, now we know we have the right foundation. It's trusted. So now, we can operate and work together seamlessly without all of these worries and risks. In the Web2 world, when they say, oh, this product is free, it's because you are the product. They are selling your data, but in Web3, you own your data and you actually get rewarded for either giving access to your data, contributing to Web3 ecosystems, being involved in various ways, like we touched on, the decentralized domains, or, you can offer compute power, you can be involved in governance, you can be a builder. And the thing is, what people, I think, get a little confused is Web3 is just another implementation of how organizations are built. We do need artists, we need design, we need software engineers, legal, finance. It's in any industry is still very relevant in Web3. And so I think whether traditional businesses, once they start to adopt a lot of these notions into their company culture alongside these technological advancements, I think it really disrupts, how their processes and operations are built, and they'll be really more primed to scale, I believe.
And I certainly agree with you. And for our listeners, perhaps may have got a bit lost during our conversation. Just taking it a step back. Web3, of course, is the third sort of phase of the internet. The first coming out, I think it's sort of 1959. And what really sort of differentiates Web3 to Web1 is that Web1 was static in nature. It was just information on the internet, much similar to like an encyclopedia. And then we have Web2, where we saw a lot of data in transit in terms of communication back and forth. And, of course, we're in the middle of that. At the moment, we've seen a lot of challenges in terms of data theft and manipulation, and Web3 is the natural progression of that, in terms of putting security at the forefront of decentralization, which I feel is significantly important. So to our audience, really, really take note today. Now, in terms of your vision, your purpose, empowering communities and fostering innovation, how does that tie into what you're doing with the business?
Yeah, absolutely. And to build off a little bit about what I was saying when it comes to community and involvement, I think Web3 does introduce a lot of new ways that people can participate and get rewarded for their participation. But I think it's really important to build these mechanisms in a truly decentralized way. And that could mean very many different things, from how do you represent, for example, voting power, or how a voice of a community member is measured. And there's different mechanisms for that, right? There's the concept of, because we're also so interconnected and your interactions are really carried with you in Web3, you can have those represent, for example, how your voice is valued in a community and when it comes to decision making. And I think, there's other things like implementing really truly voting systems that are transparent and decentralized, and different mechanisms like we see one token, one vote, or one person, one vote, or something called quadratic funding. And that is varied, but I think it's really at the core, all of these combined help you create a community that's empowered and incentivized to be involved, because the mechanisms in place naturally mean that however you contribute, the benefits are optimal for yourself, and it's like this positive feedback loop, and as well, I think there's like a massive shift in organizational structures, because it's an open community. How do you create spaces that are safe? There's this concept of sociocracy, for example, which really builds off of consent-based decision making. So within a community, when you're working together, when you're operating, how do you make decisions that are fair? And consent-based decision making is one of them, where you reach a conclusion that's really fair for everyone. Or, for example, really just creating mechanisms for meeting formats, people to be able to come together and be able to voice their perspective and work together very seamlessly. So I believe, like, through a lot of the work that we've been doing, all of these coming together is where I envision these pieces really empowering communities and enabling them to thrive and be able to contribute in a way that's meaningful for them, but naturally translates to the benefit of the whole, the community.
And we talk a lot with our guests, and Warren and I are very passionate about, obviously, well-being and mental health in the workplace, especially within the cyber sector. And we share, in our previous discussions with you, you've mentioned your passion for health and well-being. How do you integrate these values into, the development of blockchain and decentralized technologies? And how do you envisage sort of the role of decentralized systems in generally improving global health and well-being, as a whole?
Yeah, absolutely. The more I started to get involved in Web3, I think I've engaged with hundreds of people from all around the world, and order for you to be able to work with different people, be accepting and open and really just be empowering, I think it starts with yourself, doing a lot of inner work, self-reflection, healing your own traumas, building your confidence. I think that really translates outwards to you being able to be an active, empowering community member. And I think this is where these things aligned. And, I learned this fact that changed my life, but it says 90% of your serotonin is built in your gut. And, it's really interesting because we work in a space where we're sitting on our computers all the time. So that like translates naturally to maybe like foregoing some healthy habits, like getting up to or eating properly, finding the time. And I think all of these things kind of like can feed into, creating such a negative feedback loop within yourself. And so it's really, really important to be cognizant of that and kind of find this balance, especially because this space is so consuming sometimes, but I think in order to be, healthy and really, good at what you're doing and open to perspectives, because I really believe that Web3 is bringing a lot of this human element back. Not just Web3, we have AI, we have different types of automation. So now, how can humans go back to working together, to being open, not projecting, not internalizing, uplifting each other? And I think that really all starts with, healing yourself and working on yourself first.
Yeah, 100%.
And so when you asked, how do you envision the role of decentralized systems improving global health and well-being? I've started to see a lot of really interesting platforms and ideas that are emerging from Web3. Specifically, there's this one that's like, their main concept is heal to earn. So people are actually incentivized and rewarded to do things that uplift and empower their well-being, attending therapy sessions, meditating, yoga, and, it's this like gamified engagement process, but you actually get rewarded for it. And I think that is one of the most, disruptive kind of concept. I really, really loved that and resonated with it. And then obviously, like, there's very specific Web3 health and wellness communities. And because things like to DAO mechanisms and these sorts of advancements, these communities can now, actually operate seamlessly and sustainably and, provide a lot of, advancements to health and well-being, because maybe in traditional business and corporations, these things could be brushed over because there's not, enough funding, or it's not sustainable or whatnot. So I think, Web3 and decentralized systems really help empower that and bring these concepts and make them more important.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
It's encouraging to hear there's the positive benefit of it, of course, from a well-being perspective. I've read articles recently and seen stuff in media that have painted in a negative light, especially when it comes to rewards. Tap to play, for instance. I know that in the APAC region's been a hotbed for keeping people away from education and away from work because they're sat at home sort of getting tokens from tap to play. So I think the approach when it comes to well-being and health is a welcomed one in that respect.
Yeah, and sorry, I'll just add to that. I think this is really interesting as well, and that's why, because incentives are very varied globally, different, obviously in different economies. And I think this is where a lot of these governance mechanisms can help, is like, what does incentive look like? And it doesn't always have to be monetary. You can get rewarded for contribution, for engagement, for participation. And this is kind of how you can mitigate a lot of these issues and help solve, because I guess like financial incentives could become more of a negative thing than a positive thing because of how it's absorbed globally.
Most definitely. And sort of moving away from that, just sort of refocusing on your founder's journey. For the audience, could you share with us Amlock's core mission and how does it drive your strategy and innovation in the blockchain-based crowdfunding space?
Of course. So AMLOK's core mission, we want to enable every project creator, small, medium business owner, influencer, independent owner to raise capital without sacrificing equity, while also fostering, community engagement. And we do all of this through blockchain-based transparency and automation. So, we leverage blockchain for trust and security. We ensure, that all the transactions are transparent and immutable, but then also via smart contracts, which are these self-executing contracts, we remove any intermediaries, and those automate fund distribution and rewards. So these innovations, they really help transform crowdfunding. And with AMLOK, we're really trying to base it as a community-driven, transparent, and reward-centric ecosystem.
Brilliant, really impressive. And how do you see AMLOK shaping the future of decentralized crowdfunding? What key innovations are you focusing on right now, if you don't mind me asking?
Yeah, of course. So I'll just kind of give a quick background on traditional crowdfunding models to just paint a picture. We really have three types of crowdfunding. We have donation based, where you really, your altruistic reasons, you give something for nothing. There's reward based, like non-financial rewards, like a Kickstarter kind of model. And then there's equity based, where companies raise and they sacrifice some of their equity, they give some of their equity. But with AMLOK, we're really trying to disrupt that by leveraging these technologies. And so, for example, through smart contracts, they act as the fund managers, the escrows. They automate fund distribution, and they hold the funds so no one has access to them. For example, we use NFTs for ownership of rewards. And then we've also introduced a new non-speculative way for backers to get involved and get rewarded, and that's through revenue sharing opportunities for involvement. So, by integrating a lot of these Web3 principles with real business models, we're trying to bridge the gap between traditional and decentralized finance. And we're trying to make crowdfunding, more accessible, engaging, profitable for both backers and the projects that they're supporting, or the creators.
That's brilliant. And we'd love to obviously get into more detail into that at a future time. And I'm curious, how do you balance the need for technical and technological innovation with social impact, ensuring that Amlock's offerings not only driving growth, but also contributing to the community empowerment?
Yeah, I think with Amlock's model, it creates a positive feedback loop that's really intrinsically benefits both businesses and their communities, or like creators and their backers. So first, there's democratizing access to capital. So now we have small business owners, project creators from underrepresented, economically challenged locations, for example, that can raise funds without giving up equity. We have also backers that now can get involved in these projects, can invest, can have opportunities. So through blockchain and these innovations, we've been able to kind of democratize access that way. And then, constantly empowering backers with active participation. So the involvement of, giving supporters a stake in the project that's represented with their NFTs, those revenue sharing tokens, maybe also implementing these DAO mechanisms. It really allows backers and their creators to be engaged and participate. And it creates this your success is my success kind of notion. And then obviously financial inclusion that goes hand to hand with access, but we accept both fiat and crypto. We've really designed the platform to be Web2 friendly as well. So we're really focused on user experience, and that opens up, makes it very usable and friendly for both types of backgrounds, people that are familiar with Web3, not familiar with Web3, because we're just trying to keep this technology in the background, in the back end. And then the last thing as well, it creates new economic opportunities. Small business owners are the backbone of every economy. Maybe I think one of the metrics of how you measure how successful an economy is, it's judged by the success of these local businesses. And so with AMLOK, we really want to empower these local businesses, and we really want to empower local economies and give them a solution to thrive together.
Governments take note. I mean, look, as a highly accomplished leader and listening to the fascinating sort of background on AMLOK, and in your opinion, what do you think are some of the most critical skills that tech leaders need to cultivate in themselves, and obviously their teams, and in order to stay ahead of the curve?
I think we touched on this a little bit when I was kind of mentioning how Web3 brings a lot of the human elements back. I think one of the biggest things is empathy. Empathy, curiosity, autonomy, being able to be agile and iterative and not really attached to one thing, I think is really important. The space is really ever evolving. I mean, you want to be as agile as possible and be able to evolve with it, but you really need to be open-minded. In this space, it's very new. Every perspective is important at this stage because, all of these opinions and perspectives need to come in to building these foundations that could, help these companies grow sustainably. So I think these are, to me, the most important, characteristics that people in this space should embody.
And it's a question we all ask ourselves from time to time, and I'm sure many founders, we were navigating their own challenges with scaling. If you could go back in time, what's the one piece of advice you wish you'd maybe received at the start of your journey?
Yeah, I got this from our amazing consultants at Advatech, and they're constantly like, do not assume. Just execute and iterate. Don't assume anything, And because we're so deep into this space and into like the nitty-gritty, you kind of forget to take a step back. So I think one thing is just don't be so attached to how you're doing things. Don't assume. Just iterate, put it out there and then just experiment and be open-minded and have the foundations in place to just have this like really iterative process.
There's an old saying that don't assume makes an ass out of you and me. It's an old saying from many years ago. Well, look, I mean, it's been fascinating listening to your story and a great episode. To sort of come to the back end now, what does the future hold for you and Amllock?
Yeah, we're in a really exciting phase right now. We're launching officially end of this month. We have amazing partners. We're partnered with a company called Lingo AI. So they're using our platform to help fund and distribute their innovation. They've created AI agent headphones that, act as real-time translators, but also they're connected obviously through DeepIn and blockchain. They preserve languages and heritage. So they're using Amllock to raise funds for these AirPods to distribute in, underserved communities. But also we have, amazing creators that are going to be launching. And so, for anyone that's interested, you can sign up as a backer, you can sign up as a creator. You receive some awards and incentives for doing so and for being pioneers with Amllock. So that's really exciting. And we're now officially also starting our own fundraise. So yeah, very exciting things happening with Amllock. I'm very excited for the next few months. And for myself, I'm extremely passionate about decentralized governance. I work with a company called Fortrek as well. We're an innovation company. We've cultivated a lot of these, new organizational structures, and we implement them, and we work with a lot of ecosystems to help them mitigate risk in superintelligence and governance. And so there's a lot of exciting work there, especially as AI advances. So yeah, overall, busy time, but very exciting.
Absolutely, yeah, sounds it. And look, for any of our listeners who want to stay connected beyond this episode, and I'm sure there may be many, where else can they reach you?
Yes, I'm on LinkedIn, Juana Attieh. You can just find me there. X as well, Attieh Joanna. And then I just started a business account on Instagram, so I'll be posting a lot more about founder insights, creators, projects, health and wellness. So just to keep a lot of our community engaged as well. So you can just give me a follow there, connect with me. But yeah, I'm really open to any chat, any connection. I love talking to people and meeting people in the space and out of the space. So yeah, I'm really happy to connect with anyone.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, look, Joanna, a huge thank you from Warren and myself. I'm sure that the community and all our listeners would have found this episode fascinating. And some really good insight on a topic that still remains somewhat of a mystery to many people. So, great work. To continue the discussion and for more sustained engagement, we invite you to join the Secure Cyber Connect community, where we're offering a range of collaborative solutions to both tech and security professionals at no cost, as always. These include expansive community access, mutual mentoring programs, online networking sessions, and a range of exclusive interviews such as this, with panel discussions and masterclasses coming throughout 2025. If you want to learn more and gain access to the community in any of our initiatives, please visit secure-recruitment.com/cyber-connect/. Thank you very much.
To encourage diverse and inclusive knowledge sharing, please like, subscribe and share on our YouTube channel.